But an interesting thing happened in the day of David. Now listen to me, and you might want to write this down. I always say that David, more than any other person, was a New Testament saint living in Old Testament times. That's why David's different. It's because he had New Testament type revelation, man. He knew something about God that most of the people in the Old Testament just did not quite see. This is what makes David so wonderful. David didn't really have, like any healing miracles or anything like that. I mean, he did have miracles. I mean, killing Goliath was a miracle, things like that. I mean, some awesome things happened. He was slaying 10,000s of the Israel's enemies and things like that, making Saul jealous. So he was a man of miracles. But what he was more than that was a man of revelation. He was a man who did know his God. He was a young boy just who was out there shepherding. Some commentators say that he was an illegitimate son of Jesse. Maybe just think about that. I mean, possibly he wasn't even Jesse's real son. You know, he was like a bastard child. But yet God has a way of taking sometimes what society casts off and taking them to himself. And so it was David's job to be out with the sheep of his father. And he had all these, brothers that were like the who's who. They were all the big and, the strong, and they did this in high school and that in college, and they had done all these things to the point where when Samuel went down to anoint the next king, God said, there's a king coming out of Jesse's house, go down and anoint him. Samuel had to go through the whole list, and each time he just said, this has got to be the guy. The oldest son, I forget what his name was, maybe Eliab or something like that. And, Samuel looks at him and is like, wow, this guy's big, he's strong, he looks intelligent. He's got to be the man. And God's like, no, he's not the man. And so they bring out and there's a great point here. I always tell people, don't always try to get God to tell you exactly what to do. Just keep moving, and when God tells you what not to do, don't do it. That's one of the best ways to keep moving in God. It's one of the best ways to keep yourself from becoming double-minded, to get where you're thinking, maybe I should do this or I could do that. Man, Samuel didn't let that bother him. God said, no, Eliab's not the one. So he goes to the next one. God says the next one. All the way, I think there were 7 of them, all the way through them, not him, not him, not him, not him. It's like your head starts to swim after a while. And God doesn't say there's one more. He has to ask, do you have another son? And they're like, yeah, there's another son, but you don't want to see him. He's the kid that's out there with the sheep. Possibly the bastard child. I'm trying to hide out, trying to keep away from everybody, till I get my reputation back. I don't know if that's true, but it could be. That's David. He's out there somewhere. And Samuel's like, I'm not going anywhere until somebody goes and gets him, and do it fast. Bring him in here. We're going to see what God has to say about it. That's David. David learned something, with his experience, his life, walking in his shoes. God taught him something about, how to walk with God. And he had this New Testament type of revelation. So when you see this phrase, the tabernacle of David, you just have to stop and make a note of it. Because in the New Testament, it says that the apostles in the early church, when they had the council in Jerusalem, Acts 15, they understood that God was going to take the gospel now to the Gentiles because of this passage of Scripture. Because God said, I will raise up the tabernacle of David. There was something in this prophecy, and there was something in the tabernacle of David that they realized this is what God is going to do in the last days. And so we need to move with that. Now, I was doing a little research, and I found out that in David's day, they had 2 tabernacles. They had the tabernacle of Moses, and it was on Mount Gibeon. And it was being used all the time, just like it always had been, for the worship, of the Jewish people, of the Hebrew people at that time. But at the same time, and we're not really told why, but at the same time, as David became king and moved into Jerusalem and took over the Jebusite stronghold that was called Zion, and made that not only his house, but made it God's house, at that time, he began to set up another tabernacle. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to that tabernacle, and there weren't different sections in that tabernacle. It was just a tent with the Ark in it, and there was praise and worship around it, in and around it all the time. He set up a completely new order. And like I said, we're not told why, but we know that both things were happening. God was, giving us a picture, I think, of here's where I'm going. Something new is being instituted. Something new is happening. David was a prophet. David, you're seeing something and you're building something that I'm using for an example for what's coming. David was a person he was illustrating as an example of Christ. Something that they'd be able to look at and say, man, when Jesus gets here, that's the Christ. That's the Son of the living God. That's the one that was prophesied about and talked about. But in David's economy of doing things, he realized both things were important. There was a shift. There was a movement from the old to the new. And even though he was hundreds of years before Jesus, I mean, he saw it and moved with it. How does that speak to you and me this evening in this place? God can give us a word. We can begin to see something. It could be a long ways off, but God may be using us to just begin to walk in and institute something that's coming. In the last days, you'll come back here, but go into the New Testament and go to the book of Acts. See if I can find it for you. Acts 15. Acts 15, I know it's down, I think it's towards the middle to latter. If you find it before me, just tell me which verse it is. It must be about in the middle of the chapter. Anybody see the wording in there anywhere? Verse 16? Thanks. Easier for me to find when I have a Bible page to look at. When I'm scrolling up, I only have about 2.5 verses at a time. I don't know where I'm at. Okay, they're having this council, about what to do with the Gentiles. What kind of things that we should, ask them to do. Should we make them just keep all the Hebrew law and that kind of thing? And eventually we understand they decided not to do that. Verse 15, it says, and to this degree, verse 14, Simon has declared how God at first did visit the Gentiles, talking about Cornelius' house, and to take out of them a people for his name. And to this agree the words of the prophets, as it is written, after this will I return and will build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down. And I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up, that the residue of men might seek after the Lord.